Well, it's still the culture series on Today with John and Helen, and this segment of our program will focus on the Africans in diaspora.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Africans in diaspora. And we have on hand a good friend all the way from Canada, Mr. Nduka Otiono.
And Nduka Otiono is doing us so proud there in Canada and taking us through all that, pertains to Africa. Nduka Otiono is a writer, by the way. He's associate professor and graduate program coordinator at the Institute of African Studies, Carleton University. He is the author and co-editor of 8 books of creative writing and academic research. Prior to turning to academia, he was for many years a journalist in Nigeria, General Secretary of Association of Nigerian Authors, founding member of the Nigerian chapter of UNESCO, Committee on Oral and Intangible Cultural Heritage, and founding member of the board of £1,000 annual Nigerian Prize for Literature. His research interest spans cultural studies, oral performance and literature in Africa, post-colonial studies, media and communication studies, globalization and popular culture. He is author of an award-winning book titled The Night Hide with a Knife. Wow. Okay.
I'm surprised you were able to take all of that with 2 breaths.
What do you mean, John?
So like I said, our focus falls on Africans in diaspora. Yes. It's quite an interesting topic. Well, by way of welcoming our guests onto the program, we want to look at the peculiar nature of the expression of our culture by our brothers and sisters living abroad. Those are the ones we refer to as the Nigerians in diaspora. Mr. Nduka, could you please give us an idea of how our culture is segmented in the diaspora? Are we seen as a whole, national, or are we still sticking to our tribal differences?
By way of welcoming Nduka, what part of Nigeria are you from?
I'm from Delta State. I'm from Ogwashipu.
How do we greet you with respect?
Ede.
Ede.
Yes, that's right.
So we say Ede to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Okay.
And thanks for having me. It has to take a matter of culture to get me up so early in the morning, around 4 a.m. and thereabout.
Okay.
But it's definitely my pleasure. Yes, you talk about culture, whether it's, let me reframe it, do we have like a monolithic African culture?
Yeah.
Or do we have like a plural African culture? And I think that's a good way of looking at it. And my response will be one of the major issues that we contend with in the diaspora, especially as academics and intellectuals, is the idea of Africa not being a country. So we say Africa is not a country. That being the case, because it's important to recognize the plurality, the multiplicity of cultures that are united within one continent. And the same applies to Nigeria. If you take Igbo land, for example, where I come from the Igbo west of the Niger, and we are proudly Enoeni people. It's a subgroup within the larger Igbo group. So even in the diaspora, while we recognize unity as people of culture from the same continent or from the same country, it's interesting to note that people also are proud of their minority cultures. So we have the major cultures, dominant cultural groups like the Yoruba, the Hausa, the Igbos, and then if you go to East Africa, you can also think about the various other groups that are there that are the large groups. Sure. But we also do have the minority groups, and you have groups. So you have in the Nigerian Association, the Nigerian Canadian Association, for example. Okay. But you also do have the ethnic groups, that operate. So there is that necessity to recognize our broader culture, but it's also important to recognize those minority, if we might use that, subcultures.
Okay.
And this plays out in the diaspora as well.
Okay.
So if you have the big Yoruba party, but you also have the Edo party, and then you have the Anyama parties or Anyama groups, and so on and so forth.
And you celebrate the festivals too when we do ours back home.
Yes, well, as much as possible. You know how it is with social media. Social media globalization has shrunk the world a whole lot, which is why it is possible for you and I to be having this conversation, you know, via digital network.
Yeah. All right. So where do the newer generations, you know, our concern is more on the newer generations because there's so much distracting them, globalization. And it's difficult for a lot of them to see the good in us because they are driven towards a lot of the things that are happening on the other side. And those things are seen as better than what we have here. So where do the newer generations learn the authentic cultural practices of their home country? You know, where you are now, how? You have talked about the things that you do, maybe with the adults, with the parents. How about the younger ones? Can they rely on their parents alone? Or are there other platforms and opportunities?
That's a very important question, and one that I think every diaspora resident, you know, should take seriously. Home is a place. Home is the headquarters of the family, and the home is the headquarters of culture. So it's very important from my experience that families and parents model their cultures. For example, I don't joke with my African wears, and today I'm happy very proudly to wear this top given to me by Airtelbet, which is a Nigerian designer. And so in doing so, with sporting Airtelbet and sporting our cultural cap, I do this very often in many places within localities there and internationally. And what this does, say in my own home and for my daughter, is to see the necessity of our culture, the importance of our culture, the beauty in our culture. Because we are already beginning to talk as academics in terms of new African diaspora. And, you know, well, not necessarily that way, but the old African diaspora. So we have children who are being born here, or children who have moved from Nigeria, for example, and from other African countries, who, as they grow up, have lived more in the diaspora than at home, or those who are born here completely. And so we try as much as possible to encourage them to retain those cultural practices. And the most challenging aspect of it is language. You do know, even living in Nigeria, that a lot of children in the cities can't speak their local languages, can't speak their mother tongue, which is a tragedy. And then you imagine how much so it is in the diaspora when these children are, you know, within thousands of kilometers removed from the cultural roots that would have allowed them access to learn the language. And so if I use myself as an example, I am proud to say that my daughter Kika speaks our language. And when we traveled home a few years back for my dad's funeral, lots of people in Nigeria and in our family were surprised to see that a child who has lived in Canada can speak the language. Language is identity. And so some of these things, if we do not make this connection and do not sustain them with these children, they'll be lost forever. And in terms of their cultural background. This is also reflected on Nigerian children, you know, Nigerian students, international students who come over here. After a while, because the larger environment requires them to learn the tongue, or rather to learn the pronunciation. And you come from a culture back home in schools where you were punished in some schools for speaking vernacular in class. Much so then when you have this opportunity internationally, you want to speak like a Canadian. You want to get a Canadian accent. And in so doing, gradually, you also begin to lose that connection. But the best would be being able to code switch. I'm sure some of you in communication, you know, code switching. I like to see children who are in the diaspora, either born here or have moved, having the capacity and the ease with which to move from Nigerian pidgin to Canadian accent and back and so on and so forth, which is what I see that I'm proud to say my daughter Kika has modeled.
And indeed, that actually addresses the next question that balance. I was going to ask you. I was going to say, Mr. Otiono, please, let's be fair. Let's try and be fair to your daughter, for instance, right? Let's agree first that, yes, there have been influences in Canada through no fault of hers, right? Now, and at the same time, we are putting a little bit of pressure, call it another thing, if not pressure.
Retain your identity.
Right? To retain your identity, which is justified. But how do they now balance their acquired foreign cultures with the original cultural practices that we're trying to preach to them?
So I'll give you the example of the Chinese. A lot of Chinese families in the diaspora ensure that they bring their children up, through Chinese culture or being exposed to Chinese culture. And how do they do that? They typically bring their parents. You talked earlier about Omuwo at the beginning. This is something that has far more significance than the idea of coming to look after a mother who has just given birth to a baby, to help her through that practice. It is the beginning of this initiation into our culture. And the Chinese have made a fantastic show of it. The Indians also do that. But within the African environment, especially within the Nigerian context, where we are always slaying and taking a whole lot of pride in advertising and associating with Western culture, sometimes this is lost in the home. Creating the balance is a very big challenge. And, children like Kika would have to find ways to navigate it. But I believe that the foundation, the very strong foundation that is required, is to make these children aware of their culture and to be proud of their culture. Would your child be comfortable eating eba with her hands at a party? That's a simple question. It looks simple, but it's very complicated. And why would a child not be comfortable enough to eat eba or to ask for eba, to order eba, and then feel comfortable rather than pizza? These things, food can be so culturally oriented and could be the basis for us to even analyze the question that you asked.
Okay.
So there is no easy way to balancing it. It has to be a struggle, but there has to be a consciousness. But above all, there has to be that cultural pride that makes you in the first place to be happy sporting your African attire. And now there are beautiful designers all over the country in Nigeria. And then we can also see this coming out in music.
Thank
Being
you so much.
proud to play your local music and your local artists.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. While you were talking, my mind was just wondering, we have embassies everywhere. Every nation has got an embassy in every country. And Nigeria has their embassies also in almost all of the countries of the world. And so I'm thinking, apart from the individual efforts of diasporans, from wherever in Africa,
Yes.
is the embassy also in a position to assist in entrenching the cultural values and traditions of the people, from where they are serving?
Yes, the embassies ideally ought to be the bulwark of the promotion of the country's culture. However, the embassies also deal with a lot of challenges, especially the African embassies. I live in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. And so the diplomatic corps is headquartered in Ottawa. And being a professor in the Institute of African Studies also means that I have regular interactions with these cultural embassies. And I have been very closely associated with the Nigerian embassy here, the Nigerian High Commission in Canada, from Chief Ojomade Kwe to our current ambassador. And I do know the struggles that they go through in terms of funding. How do you manage the necessity of promoting your culture and also dealing with the financial resources that are required, to do so? Within the limits of the funding that they get, they try as much as possible to do that, observe Nigerian holidays, and especially the Nigerian Independence Day, and encourage, the different ethnic associations in Ottawa and also the larger Nigerian Canadian Association. Also to conduct some of these, to advertise or to promote our culture. But that's as much as it can get.
Okay.
There are different ways that these cultural practices can be promoted. And if you take the example of the advanced countries, say United States, take Britain, or take Germany, for example, or Canada, you will notice in Nigeria that they do not make light of bringing in writers, artists, from their various countries to visit Nigeria. And then also to organize events around them. Sometimes there might be exhibitions and sometimes actually collaborations. So there is that aspect of soft diplomacy, which culture lends itself. And one of the ways that some of these countries have used in dominating other cultures has been through this kind of soft diplomacy. You can see this happening with regard to films, especially Hollywood films, and how this has promoted American culture. That in Nigeria now, people talk about going to buy groceries and no longer buying provisions, and stuff like that. And there are a lot of ways in which American English has, taken over our conversations. We speak in terms of apartments, no longer flats, and stuff like that. These are ways in which cultures quietly, permeate other cultures. And so we always look in terms of the physicality of culture, in terms of dress, but there are those soft diplomacy which is possible through cultural practices. Bringing John and Helen, for example, to moderate an event in Ottawa. And then, because they are probably fresh out from home with the ideas going on, or even in terms of the specific cultural practices, because culture evolves. And this kind of mobility, in an age of globalization, mobility is so central, but so also is the more diverse aspects of culture that are unseen rather than the ones that are seen. So the embassies are in a position, but they are also heavily challenged.
Yeah, interesting points you've made. Yeah, interesting points you've made. Well, I want to recognize first the fact that you have something to do with Carleton University in Ottawa. And I remember visiting Carleton some years ago. Quite an impressive... Oh,
really?
Oh, yes. Quite an impressive setup. And I noted at the time that there was, in fact, a Ghanaian or so who was heading the Department of African Studies or something. So I must say that Carleton itself, the environment that you have even positioned yourself, adds a lot to the value that we are getting from you today. So thank you so much. Now let's come to a point that I've been trying to. I would need you to confirm something to me. It has been in the it has been circulating. Yeah, there's a little soft argument about it, in this part of the world. Is it true that Africans abroad value the preservation of our culture even more than most of us back home?
You're entering a very big topic, John. And a very big one that has not just, the artistic value. As I said, arts and culture lends itself to soft power diplomacy. And then if you think even more about lending, the first thing that comes to my mind is the controversies around Nigerian stolen art. Yeah, so if you think about the crusade, the kind of advocacy that Nigerians and diaspora and also at home have done, you will begin to really, really understand the extent to which the question that you just asked could take us.
Wow.
Yes, very fiercely so, but it's not a straightforward answer or one that is so categorical that Africans and diaspora promote or very fiercely, maintain our legacy, our cultural legacy. The point to be made is that, again, it's to some extent individually driven. But on the whole, the distance from home creates also a certain kind of nostalgia that makes people sometimes distance, allowing them to further appreciate their cultural practices.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you asked earlier a question that is also central, one that has to do with how do you balance it? How comfortable do I feel entering the lecture room at Carleton, wearing what I'm wearing right now?
Okay.
Or how do I feel, advertising and promoting African art? But, the fact there is that increasingly, with the experience that we have had with these young people, the NSAS generation, who have now exported Nigerian culture in terms of music, film, clothes, it's also created a backdrop of greater cultural pride. Yeah. Because, our culture is becoming global. Our culture is getting into the global cultural conversation. So this is in itself empowering to people like me who will enter the classroom. One of the courses I teach at Carleton is called Globalization and Popular Culture in Africa.
Yeah.
And I teach another course called the African City. And these are courses that are popular, you know, because students are interested in knowing more about African culture.
Yeah. Now,
and so we become ourselves bastions of our culture, but we also realize that we are all ambassadors, cultural ambassadors in our various localities within or outside Nigeria. And there are people like us who proudly, you know, accept that responsibility and promote it, whether it's in the classroom or is within political circles or in the corporate sector. And we're happy to always speak for our culture and to advocate for it.
In just a minute or two, that's another controversy. Africans, other African nationalities abroad, more patriotic, you know, in the area of showcasing their culture and tradition much more than Nigerians abroad. In 1, 4, 5 words, please.
I wouldn't like to be bracketed into that very. It's like trying to pigeonhole me. This is what I have said about. Not necessarily.
Okay.
You know, not necessarily. Yes, that would be my question. Nigerians are fiercely proud of their culture, and this generation, the younger generation, make them even prouder of it, more than the politicians and the business people.
So that would be the 4 words. That would be the 4 words.
You counted them. And that's an excellent point to say thank you to our great guest.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And please keep up the good work. The African culture, the Nigerian culture is priceless. We must keep it running.
I agree with you.
Thank you.
Our love to all of our dear friends in Ottawa.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to having you someday after the pandemic is
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right then. Oh, well, this has been something else.
Yes.
Something very, very interesting, looking at culture. When we started on this series, we didn't know it was going to go this wild. But we're glad we did. And we're glad that you have learned a lot, you know, looking at our culture and tradition.
Yes.
It's
so
time to take a break.
we've had our top 5 cultural practices, and we've had Africans in diaspora. So what's the future of our culture? Ferron and her guests will be taking that on after the break.